From FingerLakes1.com, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Today we're talking about fake news. Over the next several weeks, we'll be bringing in a host of different voices and perspectives to talk about the evolution of the news business, what some of the trends are, and the things that we've seen happen in the headlines, because news has become part of the headlines over the last year and a half. But our guest today is Cayuga Community College Media and Telecommunications Program Director, Steve Keeler. Steve, thank you so much for being in today.
Oh, thanks for asking me, Josh. I appreciate it.
So first, before we start jumping into all of the nitty-gritty about the media business and where it stands right now, for our listeners who might not know you, a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with news.
Oh, sure.
Why?
So I'm a professor at Cayuga Community College. I'm the director of the media production and media communications programs there. I've been there since the late 80s. I got my start as a journalist when I was 16, working after school at a small weekly newspaper. Worked in journalism for a while, then went to the Newhouse School, got trained in TV and radio, and then started working in cable television as a producer, an executive producer, and production manager, and eventually made my way into higher education, which I love, especially at a community college.
So I have to ask your take on the state of media in 2018 as it sits right now.
Well, it's in transition, I think. Things are constantly changing. I mean, we're seeing newspapers, contract and get smaller left and right, seeing subscribership go down. We're certainly seeing the rise of new media, news on the internet, such as things like you guys do here.
Yeah.
It's fascinating for me to watch, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't think anybody knows at this point how it's going to turn out. It'll be interesting to see, I think, over the next 10 to 20 years, what the newspaper business does to survive. It'll be interesting to see if some of the streaming platforms and internet platforms like yours become more newspaper-like. Mm-hmm. But I think, as a media professional or a young person going into the media, it's a really exciting time to get involved. I think there's a lot of doors opening up for young people, particularly on internet platforms, but I think they've got to be a lot more versatile than they had to be 20 years ago.
So specifically, you touched a little bit on the sort of the change that's happening with traditional platforms. Putting that sort of creative thought process into it, what are some of the things that you think could be done in those traditional platforms to sort of reinvigorate things or to re-strengthen what I think is still a really strong base? Because I think they still have a ton of support at the ground, at the root level.
Well, I think, if we're talking about traditional newspapers, like let's say something like in this area, what do we have? The Post-Standard is the big, mm-hmm. daily metro. Yeah. Excuse me. The Citizen in Auburn is very close by here. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. I think one of the things they've got to do is reach out to younger readers, right? The millennial, what we call the millennial generation, for
Yep.
lack of a better term. When I'm in class with students, I have a tendency to use my students as a focus group, right? I'm always checking with them to say, okay, what are you reading? What are you looking at? What are you watching, right? Early on in one of the first days in class, I'll ask them, how many of you subscribe to a daily newspaper? In a class of 50, 0 hands will go up, absolute 0. And then if I ask how many of you read a paper, maybe 2 or 3 hands will go up because they'll say, oh, my parents or my grandparents subscribe to a paper, so I read it. Oh, I go to the library and I read the New York Times once in a while. So I think, our legacy media, like traditional newspapers, have not done a great job getting that generation, the young generation coming up, to understand the value of what they have to offer. Mm-hmm. I think someone like me who's a bit older, who grew up reading newspapers, I see a lot of value in what they do. I see a lot of value in the accuracy they have in covering the news and the research that they do. But I think as you look at younger people who are younger than myself, they're not seeing that value. So somehow those papers, those media, they have to show what that value is, because obviously they're losing them as readers. And if they're not going to turn to those outlets over time to get their news and get their information, then those outlets are in very, very deep trouble.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something that I think is pretty interesting. You said your students will say, I read a newspaper because my parents or my grandparents subscribe. How big is that decline? Because I hear it and I see it, that actual middle age group seems to be falling off
right.
from reading traditional newspapers and consuming traditional media almost as quickly as the really young contingency.
Yeah, from what I've read and from what I see, I think that's true. I'll use my own, personal situation. Right, I'm a newspaper subscriber.
Yeah.
I always have been. I grew up reading newspapers as a kid. I still do, and because I live in the Syracuse area, I subscribe to the Post-Standard. I'm very turned off by the Post-Standard, the experiment they undertook a few years back, which was to reduce their print edition from 7 days to 3 days a week, and to replace it with a facsimile edition that I can read on my iPad. Mm-hmm. So, now instead of, getting a paper delivered every day and being able to sit at the kitchen table in the morning and open the paper and take a look at it, I can only do that 3 days a week.
Right.
The other 4 days a week, I'm squinting at an iPad, mm-hmm. trying to read a facsimile edition of it. And it's not a very enjoyable experience. It's not one that I'm crazy about. It's one I'm even thinking about ending my subscription. Because it's kind of a dissatisfying experience. If I'm going to do that, I might as well just go to a website and do it for free.
Right. Now, does that side of it concern? Because that's one of the things we hear a lot is, folks, obviously the economics of Central New York, the Finger Lakes region, New York as a whole, people don't have as much of that discretionary income to throw around at things like a $1.75 or $2 or $2.50 newspaper. How do we find that balance? Because obviously good journalism has to be funded in some way.
Right. Sure. You've got to be able to support the staff of a newspaper. What's the value in a newsroom with reporters and researchers versus going and looking at a news story on Facebook where the information about an event is being provided by anyone, mm-hmm. right? And it's totally unfiltered. So what's the value of having trained journalists? And I think, the value of having trained journalists is the idea that, they're going to check sources. They're going to do the research. They're going to dig out the real facts. And you're going to get more, instead of, let's say, the unvarnished truth or the filter of someone with a bias, as much as possible, trained journalists are going to try to give you an unbiased view of a story or an event. Mm-hmm. But you have to pay for that.
Right.
So I think what's happened at this point is, the traditional or legacy media have not yet found the sort of sweet spot of what people are willing to pay for that. Mm-hmm. Right? There's the idea in newspapers, in particular, the idea of the paywall, right? Where if you pay, you'll have access to a better set of stories or more information than you might get on the free side of the paywall. Mm-hmm. And again, for us who are here, who are local, a great example of that is, the Syracuse newspapers, the Post-Standard. If you're a subscriber, you have access to the full and complete editions of the Post-Standard, 3 days a week in print, 4 days a week as a facsimile. And it is actually pretty easy to get through and has some value. But if you don't pay, you get Syracuse.com. Right? Which provides a lot of local news, but is certainly more difficult to navigate and certainly more difficult, loaded with ads, takes a long time to load up, can be very frustrating. So what's the sweet spot? Is it somewhere in between that? I don't think the newspaper business has really discovered it yet, which is why they're struggling, which is why, they're struggling to face the competition of internet-based platforms.
Mm-hmm. So now you have, it's almost like there are two different issues at play here. So you have that sort of happening over the long term, the last 20, 25 years. Now, in the last two, fake news. When you hear those two words used together, one, what's your immediate gut reaction to it? And two, what kind of impact do you think that actually has on the industry?
You know, when I hear the words fake news, I get disturbed. I get very disturbed. You know, the idea that a person or organizations are purposely going to put out lies and untruths under the guise of real news, under the guise of real information, and try to mislead people is very, very disturbing. And, you know, I think, you know, as an informed citizenry, you know, every one of us owes it to ourselves to to try to look at the information we get and make a determination about whether what we're seeing is real or is it fake, because nobody really is going to do it for us. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we each have to do it ourselves, which is very disturbing to me, because you know that really didn't exist just a few years ago. The idea that we had to watch out and say, "Oh, gee, you know, that's not real news. That's fake." You know, and look and you know, the idea that we have to we have to look at this site. We have to see where they got it from. We have to see if it's verifiable. I mean, what am I, a reporter? Right? I don't want to have to do that.
Yeah.
You know, I want the information that comes to me to be reliable. And you know, part of the problem, I guess, is that, you know, a platform like Facebook hasn't policed itself very well.
Right.
And we're seeing, you know, Facebook get in a lot of trouble for that just this week, right? I mean, the stock is tanking.
Yep.
You know, Congress is demanding investigations. You know, I know it's about the whole Cambridge Analytica thing and,
right.
you know, data being breached data being shared that shouldn't have been shared, and people's privacy being invaded. But I think it has to do overall with a real sloppiness by Facebook in terms of, you know, policing itself and policing what it allows on the platform. And again, that has to be balanced, I guess, with the idea that, you know, if Facebook is really a platform for everyone, there has to be a certain amount of freedom of speech.
Right.
But there's freedom, you know, they always used to say, you know, freedom of speech doesn't include the right to yell fire in a crowded theater.
Does it give you the right to lie?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question.
Right, because that sort of seems to be when you start to break it down and you start to get into it, when you have this debate happening, one side is screaming fake news, the other side is saying, wait a second, here's X, Y, and Z that prove it isn't. But the other side is still saying, nope, sorry, you're lying.
Well, you know, I'm not Thomas Jefferson and I'm not John Adams, but I do think the framers of the Constitution would have said yes. Freedom of speech does give you the right to lie, and it's up to the citizens to determine what's a lie and what isn't. All right? Freedom of speech, remember, in this country, we don't have prior restraint. The government can't come in and restrain you from your speech. The government can't restrain a newspaper from what it publishes. You can only go after people later. So I think, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, those two sort of, you know, real linchpins of our free society do give people the right to lie, and then we have to sort out later, you know, is it a lie, isn't it a lie, was it a harmful lie, you know, and all those kinds of issues. Is that, you know, I guess it's part of what you live with in a really free society, the fact that if we're not going to restrain speech and we're not going to restrain the press, then this kind of thing, fake news, is possible. And I think, you know, the framers of the Constitution believed that citizens are intelligent and they would be able to tell the difference. And I think maybe we can, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be so concerned about fake news.
Right.
And there wouldn't be such this huge outcry about fake news and why it's harmful. I think we are smart enough to spot it.
Now, one of the questions every week, whenever I do this podcast, I always search Facebook, our various social platforms, and try to pull some questions that are relevant to what we're going to be talking about. One of them was, in this whole debate about fake news, is it actually fake news or just the over-commercialization of specific news brands?
Well, I guess there's a difference. I mean, the media will take a story that's controversial and run with it, right?
Right.
Because controversy attracts viewers and readers. The more viewers and readers you have, the more you can charge for advertising, and the media is a business.
Yeah.
So, in many ways, you can't blame them for taking controversial stories and running with them, because readers and viewers seem to like that, right? Look at this whole thing with the president and this Stormy Daniels, the porn star. Why is the media running with it? Well, geez, there were 20 million viewers when she appeared on 60 Minutes.
Right.
I mean, we seem to be fascinated by this stuff as readers and viewers. So the media is a business. It has to run with it, right? But that's not the same as fake news and someone creating stories that aren't true to try to manipulate opinion. I think that's very different than a legitimate news organization following a story that's popular.
It seems to be that the line you're making the smart point that there's a difference between the two, but a lot of folks seem quick to not really want to look at that difference. Well,
I think for most of us, and I would include myself in this, if the story is about a subject I don't agree with, I'm more likely to discount it. And if the story comes from a news outlet that I disagree with, I'm more likely to discount it and say, well, they're just being partisan. And they're taking the worst part of the story and amplifying it so that their viewpoint is represented. So, for instance, if I was liberal, I would tend to discount anything I see on Fox News. Right? And if I'm conservative, I tend to discount anything I see on MSNBC. And if I'm conservative and I watch MSNBC and they're following a story about, let's say, President Trump, who's a controversial figure, and it's making him look bad, then I'm going to say, well, they're just liberals. Of course they want him to look bad. Yep. And they're taking they're not looking at the whole picture. They're just looking, they want to exploit a partisan point of view. And if I'm liberal, I look at Fox News, and they're following stories that are favorable to Trump. I would look at that and say, you know what? There's not a lot of truth to what they're saying. They're just being partisan. So part of it has to do with the idea that viewers and readers tend to discount what they don't agree with, and they tend to give more credence to what they do agree with. And as we've seen, media is a business, so we see more and more partisan outlets because it tends to increase viewership and readership. I mean, one of the reasons Fox News has become so successful is because they tend to be partisan, and they tend to play to a specific audience, and the audience likes what they have to say, and they watch.
Yeah.
And if they didn't watch, Fox wouldn't keep doing what they're doing.
We've touched on it a little bit. Donald Trump, what has he done to and I say he because he has, in a lot of ways, sort of shaken up and brought a little bit of conversation around what the media is now versus what it was 20, 25, 30 years ago. What has he done to the media? Or is he not unique at all? And this whole Donald Trump versus the press thing, just something that's being overblown now and exists during every single presidency that's ever happened.
Well, what Donald Trump does is he tweets.
Right.
Right? And he tweets all the time. So, he gives us this unfiltered view of what he thinks. And I think that's unique. I don't know that any president has ever done that before. Most presidents, their view is filtered through their communications office. And, every day there's a briefing at the White House, and, there's a message that the White House wants to put across. Well, he goes off message all the time, right? And so he gives us this unvarnished look. And, he apparently, as a human being, as an individual, doesn't like it when he gets negative press coverage, and he always says something about it. And he's president, so that gives a lot of credence to what he says. However, one thing I would say is that if we look back over the last 100, 200 years, every president comes to hate the press. Mm-hmm. Every single one. Obama went after the press. Bush went after the press. The press hounded President Clinton, right? Yep. No president likes the press. And why? Well, because in our country, in our system, the press is set up to be a watchdog of government. Mm-hmm. That's one of the roles that it has. And it's a constitutionally protected role. There's not many countries in the world who give basic constitutional protection to the press. Mm-hmm. Our country does. Because if we look back, on the reasoning of that, and the reasoning for that, and the reasoning was that the framers of the Constitution expected the press to be the watchdog of government, expected the press to be the ones who would tell us when the government was doing something wrong. And that's a very, very strong tradition in our country. So if you're the government, meaning, say, the president, who's the head of government in this country, eventually, you're going to get tired of that because the press is always, is watching you constantly, right? I mean, we see these press conferences, that every day, there's a press conference at the White House. When we see, and there's this huge throng of journalists sitting there asking questions, a lot of those questions are really hard.
Have the daily press briefings sort of outlived their usefulness in the traditional sense, given how plugged in President Trump is?
I don't think so, because that's the one chance journalists have to ask questions of the president's representative, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the president tends to bypass that. This president bypasses that right. Yeah. With his tweets, which is really, really pretty interesting. But those daily briefings do give the press the opportunity to ask these tough questions, do give the press the opportunity to even criticize what the government is doing. And, I think as angry as that might make us as citizens, depending on who the president is and depending on what our viewpoint is, I don't think we'd ever want that to go away. Mm-hmm. I don't think we would not want someone watching the government. I don't think we would ever want to put 100% of our faith and trust in the government and not have somebody watching. And the system is set up in this country so that someone, the press, is always watching. And I think part of the problem that happens, we don't see it really at a national level because, there's an awful lot of coverage at a national level. I think the problem is more at a local level. Mm-hmm. With the sort of death of, the old weekly newspapers that we used to have, and with the metropolitan dailies not really covering much that goes on in the suburban towns and the satellite cities that surround them, who's watching local government anymore? Right. How do we know what goes on in local government anymore? I don't think we do. I think people are hungry for that information as well. I think people want to know, what's going on? Why aren't the potholes being fixed? Right? Mm-hmm. Why are the parks in such bad shape? Why are the roads so bad? What's my town government doing? What's my county government doing? And I don't think we have that coverage and anybody watching the way we used to.
Is there the possibility of sort of an unintended side effect moving forward after this presidency, whether Trump serves another 4 years after his current term or not, that the sort of connectivity that exists right now, this sort of like constant feeding of information, becomes the norm and then thus trickles down into local governments, state, regional, local governments?
I think it's a really interesting question. What do you think? You think that would happen? Do you see local government officials tweeting like the president does, or trying to put their own voice out there, as opposed to, especially because of the lack of local press coverage?
It seems plausible because, like you just went down a really interesting road where you're saying, very clearly, people are hungry for it. They're hungry. They want this information. It sort of seems to me that eventually you're going to get a crop of elected leaders who take advantage, who fill that void, who say, okay, this is the simplest, easiest, least expensive way to reach people. I'm going to take advantage of it. And, those who aren't, the interesting dilemma then becomes, I guess, for the older generations, how do they get that same information? Do we have to start reporting on really tweets?
Yeah, here's okay, I'll tell you what I think. I think, when I go to town board meetings or meetings of a county legislature, mostly what I see serving on boards and county legislatures are a lot of retired people.
Yeah.
Right? Because they have the time.
Right.
And I see an awful lot of older people over 50. Mm-hmm. Again, because they're more established in their careers and they seem to have more time. Maybe their kids are grown up, so they're not spending the kind of time they used to, watching softball games, carting kids around, things like that. So, not to stereotype people,
right.
But in general, I don't think people who are over the age of 50, which seems to be what most local government boards are made up of, right? If we, just from my observation, I don't think they generally think about tweeting what they're doing as a local government official. They do some, right? I mean, I do see some of that on Twitter, but I don't think they generally think of doing it. But I think as, younger people move through the system and start to take over those roles, they're used to it.
Yeah.
And I think as we see the transition from, younger people, or older people to younger people, serving in local government, I think we're going to see a lot more direct communication from those officials. But I don't think we're seeing it yet. Right? I think what we see now is maybe folks who are interested in watching local governments and keeping an eye on what their local boards are doing, what their local councils are doing. They will do some of that. They'll provide some of that information. I remember when I was young, when I was a teenage reporter covering town boards. Every single town board, there was always somebody who was a local resident who attended every board meeting in his or her town and criticized the board for everything they were doing. Every town had somebody like that. It was amazing. It was usually somebody who was older and they had time and on their hands, and they would go to every meeting and ask questions, right? And I always thought, well, every town's got a watchdog, it seems like, right? I think that's probably still true, and I think over time what we're going to see is those people are going to be the ones who start tweeting, who start putting stuff on social media about what's happening at the town at the local level. And I think that serves a good purpose if we're not going to have some kind of press or media coverage anymore.
Broader question for you. Your opinion, First Amendment, is it in danger? Seems to be one of the big sort of looming questions right now. It seems too broad and it seems too big to ever actually get movement on. But your thoughts on that?
I would, on a personal basis, hate to see anything happen to the First Amendment. I would hate to see, any type of free speech or the free press be restricted. I think it's a little bit too easy for the folks in power to become annoyed by the press and to start talking about press restrictions. But I think that is, common among, people in power, that they are going to get annoyed by the press and start to think about ways they can muzzle the press so the press isn't as critical. I think if we ever fall into that trap, we'd regret it as a society. We would really regret not having a free press. If we look at countries that don't have a free press, do we want to be like China? Do we want to be like, some of the dictatorships in the world where, journalists are jailed when they criticize people in power? I don't think that's us in this country. I think I really believe the vast majority of people appreciate the freedoms that they have and, appreciate having a press that can say what it wants and can watch what the government is doing.
Last question before we get you out of here and on your way. What do you, having waded through all these sort of broad, tough topics, what do you tell young people? What do you tell your students who are sort of consuming all of this and saying, what did I get myself into? What is this? Am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? What do you tell those people who are sort of young or old, I guess, and on the fence, unsure about what's next?
Well, I think, if they want to become journalists, one of the things I tell them is, journalists are supposed to have ethics. They're supposed to do their research. They're supposed to tell the truth. They're not supposed to make up stories. It's a relatively simple set of ethics, and that they really should, think about following those. And we'll even look at, the journalist code of ethics, that are out there that journalistic societies will put out, so that they understand, it's a career and it's a calling, and it's a dedication to getting information out to people in an unbiased and truthful way, and that's really what they should be first paying attention to. And I'd also tell them, there's a lot of opportunity out there. Even though some of the legacy media might be pulling back, with internet platforms and internet-only programs out now, there are a lot of opportunities, and the opportunities are only going to increase in the future. And if they want a career, as journalists, they can have one. But they really need to be ethical about it, because if you're not ethical and if you're not truthful, you will be found out eventually, and that would be the end of a career.
Well, I really appreciate you coming in today. Obviously, an honor to have you here. A lot of other topics that I think we're going to get into, have you back down the road, and dive into some other little nuggets in the media business and media world. But really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. I really appreciate it. This has been great.
So that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Steve, our listeners, and of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Inside the FLX airs Sundays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum Channel 1304 and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.